I thought I was just a considerate employer, a woman who remembered that the man sitting alone in a cold car at 11 o'clock at night hadn't eaten since afternoon. I had no idea that my small nightly ritual of bringing James his coffee was the only reason I would ever find out the truth. Because one fog-thick morning in November, James drove right past our street without stopping, and in the back seat, pressed against the tinted window as if trying to disappear into the upholstery, sat my husband Daniel, and beside him, her silver hair unmistakable even in the gray wash of pre-dawn light, sat his mother, Eleanor. Between them, on the leather seat, lay a manila folder. A folder I would later discover contained a forged power of attorney bearing my signature, a document that, had it been filed that morning, would have transferred the deed of my grandmother's house directly into Eleanor's name. The worst part, the detail that still makes me feel sick when I think about it, is that I had handed James his coffee through the car window not 40 minutes before that moment. He had looked at me with those steady, tired brown eyes and said, "You're too kind to people, Mrs. Clara." I had laughed. I had told him to drive safe. I had stood in my driveway in my slippers watching the car pull away, thinking what a good and uncomplicated thing it was to take care of someone, and then I had gone back inside to make a second cup for myself, and I had no idea, none, not the faintest tremor of suspicion, that he was about to drive my husband and my mother-in-law to a notary's office before the city woke up, to sign away the only thing in the world that was truly mine. My grandmother Vera left me the house 6 years ago, 2 weeks before she died, in the specific and deliberate way of a woman who had spent 8 decades watching carefully and trusted almost no one. She pressed the key into my palm in the kitchen. The kitchen with the yellow tile from 1974 and the window that looked out over the garden she'd tended since before my mother was born. And she held my hand for a long moment without speaking, which was her way of saying everything important. "This is your floor, Clara," she finally said. Her voice was thin by then, paper thin, but her grip on my hand was still firm. "This is your floor, and no one can take the floor from under you." I had been 29, and I had wept in a way I hadn't wept since I was a child, without any particular elegance, without any concern for what it looked like, just the plain, overwhelming grief of receiving something irreplaceable from someone you are about to lose. The house sat on Maple Ridge Lane, in a neighborhood that had been unfashionable for so long it had looped back around to charming. 3 bedrooms, low ceilings, a kitchen that groaned when the wind came from the north, a back porch with a swing that needed repainting every other spring. There was no mortgage, no encumbrance, nothing owed on it to anyone. In the years after Vera died, I had painted it myself, fixed the porch railing with a YouTube tutorial and 3 weekends of mild profanity, had a new boiler put in during the winter that nearly froze every pipe in the walls. I knew every creak in every floorboard. I knew which window stuck in the summer humidity and which drawer in the kitchen had never closed properly and probably never would. The house was not impressive. It was not the kind of house that appeared in magazines or made guests go quiet with admiration. It was the kind of house that holds you, quietly, entirely, the way the right person does. I met Daniel at a dinner party in the spring, 2 years after Vera passed. He was an architect, the kind who talked about buildings the way other people talked about music, with a private, slightly embarrassed intensity, as though he was aware it was too much feeling but could not help it. He was handsome in a way that only became apparent over time. Dark eyes, hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck, a way of tilting his head when he listened that made you feel you were the most interesting person in the room. We talked for 3 hours at that dinner while the other guests drifted away around us, and by the end of the evening I had agreed to show him Vera's house, which even then surprised me. I was not usually a person who offered private things to strangers, but Daniel wasn't quite a stranger by the end of that night. He walked through the house slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything, and when he reached the kitchen with the yellow tile, he said, "This room has been loved for a very long time. You can feel it in the proportions." I married him 14 months later. His mother, Eleanor, had been a presence from almost the beginning. Not quite an obstacle, not yet, but a presence in the way that a piece of furniture in a hallway is a presence, something you had to navigate around without ever quite deciding whether it belonged there. Eleanor was 62 when Daniel and I married, precise and silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested she had once been told she was formidable and had taken it as a compliment and a life goal. She wore heavy floral perfume that arrived in a room several seconds before she did, the kind of scent that announces itself rather than offers itself, something between expensive and aggressive. She called me darling with the specific intonation of a woman who means neither the endearment nor the warmth, only the social function of the word. She had never liked me. I had understood this within the first 20 minutes of meeting her, and I had spent the next 4 years deciding it didn't matter, which I now understand was itself a form of blindness. Eleanor lived in a condo 40 minutes from us that Daniel paid for, a fact she managed to mention on a rotating basis in ways that never quite sounded like complaint but always felt like leverage. She visited every Sunday for dinner, which meant I spent every Saturday in a low-grade state of quiet stealing. She would arrive with flowers that she rearranged herself because mine never quite suited the vase, and she would ask about the house, about the pipes, the foundation, the roof, the cost of heating in winter, with the attentive proprietary curiosity of someone who considered themselves a silent stakeholder in a property they had never been offered any stake in. "Such a charming old house," she would say, her ringed fingers trailing along a windowsill or a door frame. "It must be so much work to maintain something this particular." I always smiled. Daniel always looked at a point somewhere between us. James had worked for Eleanor before he worked for us. This was the first detail I should have thought about more carefully and did not. He was a compact, dignified man in his mid-60s, gray-mustached, with the specific bearing of someone who understood professional service not as servitude but as craft. He drove Daniel to the office and back, collected Eleanor for Sunday dinners, ran errands that Daniel's architecture work left him too buried in blueprints to manage. I had liked James from the first week, instinctively and without analysis, the way you like people who carry themselves without pretension. And I had started bringing him his nightly coffee because of one February evening, 7 months into our marriage, when I had walked out to the car to ask Daniel something and found James sitting alone in the dark with the engine off, saving fuel, reading a paperback by the blue-white light of his phone screen, his breath misting faintly in the cold. He had looked up, startled, and I had felt a specific and precise shame settle in my chest. I went back inside and came out 2 minutes later with a thermos of dark roast and a square of the walnut cake I'd made that afternoon. He had accepted them with a quiet dignity that somehow made me feel I was the one receiving something. After that, it was simply the ritual it became. Every night Daniel worked late, and he worked late 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. I would make James his coffee at around 10 o'clock, wrap something small to eat in foil, and walk it down to the car. We rarely talked beyond pleasantries, but there was a warmth to it, the warmth of two people who both understood in their different ways what it meant to wait for someone in the dark. The first time Eleanor asked directly about the house's title, I was standing at the kitchen sink with my back to her, rinsing wine glasses after Sunday dinner. It was April, 7 months before the November morning, and Daniel had stepped out to take a work call, and Eleanor and I were alone together in the kitchen, which always had the particular quality of being alone with something that was watching you. "Clara, darling," she said, and I heard the soft clink of her wine glass being set on the table. "I've been thinking about estate planning lately. It's something one starts to consider at my age." She let a small, self-deprecating pause settle here, a pause that was meant to establish intimacy, but functioned instead like the space before an invoice. "When Vera left you this house, was it a straightforward deed transfer, or was there a trust structure involved?" I turned off the tap. I turned around. Eleanor was watching me from the kitchen table with an expression of perfectly arranged pleasantness, interested but not greedy, curious but not scheming, a performance so polished that for a moment I almost believed it. "Just a deed," I said. "She transferred it to me directly. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason." She turned her wine glass slowly with her fingers. "I'm simply educating myself on these things. Daniel's future is always on my mind. You know how mothers are." She smiled, that smile that showed only the front teeth, bright and blunt as a wall. It must be such a comfort to own something outright at your age. No bank involved, no one to answer to. She sipped her wine. "Vera must have trusted you enormously." I said yes, she had, and steered the conversation to something else. But after Eleanor left that evening, after the particular process of her departure, the coat, the cheek kiss that landed somewhere near my jaw, the reiterated compliment about the chicken that had arrived one syllable too late to be sincere, I stood in the kitchen washing the last glasses alone, and I felt something I had no name for yet, a small, low feeling behind my sternum, like a sound just below the threshold of hearing. I told myself it was nothing. Eleanor was always asking questions about things that weren't her business. It was one of her consistent qualities, like the perfume, like the flowers she rearranged. It didn't mean anything. I was still telling myself this 3 weeks later when I came home from work to find Eleanor sitting at our kitchen table with a folder of papers, talking to Daniel in the concentrated, low voice that stopped the instant the door opened. "Clara!" Her brightness was assembled so quickly it was almost impressive. "I was just showing Daniel some investment materials. My advisor has been particularly brilliant lately." She gathered the papers with efficient hands, and Daniel gave me that small, slightly too reassuring smile I had been learning to read without admitting I was reading it. "Just numbers," he said. "Nothing interesting." He kissed my forehead. The folder disappeared somewhere I couldn't see. I went to the bedroom to change out of my work clothes. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the afternoon quiet of the house, listening to the low murmur of Daniel and Eleanor's conversation resuming in the kitchen, and I thought, I'm doing it again. I'm turning something into nothing because the alternative is too large and too ugly, and I'm not ready. I changed my clothes. I went back downstairs. I made tea. I was pleasant through the remainder of Eleanor's visit, and when she finally left, I helped Daniel clear the wine glasses, and I did not ask him about the folder. And for the next 4 days, I thought about nothing else. Then came the phone call. I woke at 1:30 in the morning to find Daniel's side of the bed empty, and I lay in the dark for a long moment before I heard his voice from downstairs. from the study through the closed door, low and careful and clearly not meant to carry. I could not make out a single word, only the tone, and the tone said with unmistakable clarity, "This is not a conversation I would have in the daylight." I lay still, staring at the ceiling, breathing slowly. An international client, I told myself. Architecture was a global business, different time zones, different hours. He came back to bed at 2:15. I kept my eyes closed. I said nothing in the morning. I hated myself for both. The week before everything broke open, I noticed James's driving patterns had shifted. Not dramatically, because James was too professional for drama, but in the subtle, consistent way that things shift when they are accommodating a new variable. There was a Tuesday evening route that added nearly 20 minutes to Daniel's commute. There was a morning I came down earlier than usual and found James on his phone, who ended the call with a speed that was involuntary, reflexive, the speed of a person who has been caught. "Morning, Mrs. Clara," he said, and took the thermos I handed him. His eyes were steady, but they landed a fraction of a second late, the way eyes do when they are working to appear natural. "Cold today," I said. "Yes," he agreed. We both looked at the middle distance for a moment. I went back inside. The night before everything changed, I made his coffee as always. Dark roast, 2 sugars, the splash of milk, and wrapped a piece of gingerbread in foil. It was 10:30 at night, and the air outside was cold and absolutely clear, the kind of cold that amplifies sound, that makes every footfall and every far-off car engine ring in the night air like something struck. James rolled down the window and accepted the thermos. He looked at me for a moment, just a moment, and something passed across his face that I would not identify until later. Not guilt, exactly. Not yet, but the near cousin of guilt, the expression of a man who knows more than he should and less than he wishes. "You're very kind, Mrs. Clara," he said. I said good night. I went inside. I went to bed at midnight, and I lay awake for a long time, listening to the house settle in the cold. I do not know what woke me at 5:37 the next morning. No sound, no alarm, simply the deep animal certainty that I needed to be downstairs. The way you sometimes wake, knowing that something has changed in the house without being able to name what. I went down and made coffee. Automatic, the muscle memory of it. And I stood at the kitchen window with my mug and looked out at the still dark street. The neighborhood was utterly quiet. And then headlights came around the corner at the end of Maple Ridge Lane, and I recognized the shape of our black sedan moving slowly eastward, away from the city, not toward it, not stopping at the house, not slowing, moving with the calm, purposeful pace of something that has a destination and knows exactly where it is. In the back seat, caught for just 1 second in the cold orange wash of a streetlight, Daniel sitting forward slightly, wearing the dark coat I'd given him for Christmas. And beside him, unmistakable, her silver chignon visible even through tinted glass, Eleanor. And between them, resting on the seat, the edge of a manila folder. I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully, because I was afraid if I wasn't careful, I would drop it. I stood in the kitchen in my socks and my borrowed stillness, and I understood, not suspected, not feared, but understood, with the calm and terrible clarity of a person who has finally let themselves see what they have been looking at for months. That something had been happening for a very long time, that I had been standing in the middle of it all along, bringing coffee to the man who was driving it. I did not call Daniel's phone. I stood at the kitchen window for another full minute, watching the street return to its ordinary emptiness, and I thought about what I knew and what I needed to know and what I was going to do with the distance between those two things. Then I went upstairs, dressed quickly and quietly in the dark, jeans, a sweater, my heaviest coat, and I came back down and picked up my car keys from the hook by the door. I knew the name of only one notary office that opened before 8 in the morning. I had used it myself 2 years earlier for a simple document Daniel had needed witnessed on short notice. It was 12 minutes from our house in a low brick building on Alderton Street, with a parking lot that faced the main road. I parked across the street at 6:14, and our black sedan was already there. I sat in my car with the engine idling, my hands in my lap, and I watched the glass door of the notary office. The heat from the vents was too warm, and I turned it down. A bakery 2 doors down had its lights on, and the smell of something sweet drifted through the car's ventilation in a way that was deeply at odds with everything I was feeling. I waited 11 minutes. Then the glass door opened and Eleanor came out first, walking with the particular composed authority of a person who has just concluded a satisfying transaction. She wore her camel coat, her hair immaculate, her expression arranged in the private satisfaction of someone who is not yet trying to hide it. Daniel followed 2 steps behind her. He was looking at the ground. James pulled the car around and they got in, and I sat very still and did not start my engine and did not follow them, because I understood, suddenly and with great precision, exactly what I needed to do instead. I needed to walk into that notary office before anyone filed anything, before any document left that building, before the morning moved 1 step further in the direction Eleanor had planned for it. I waited until the black sedan had turned out of the parking lot and disappeared. Then I got out of my car and walked across the street and pushed open the glass door. The notary was a small, neat man named Mr. Petrov, whom I vaguely remembered from my previous visit. He looked up from his desk with a professional pleasantness that shifted, almost imperceptibly, when he saw my face. Whatever my face was doing, it was apparently legible. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and I could see from the slight tightening around his eyes that he recognized me and understood immediately that my being here was not a coincidence. "The document my husband just had witnessed," I said. My voice was very level. I was proud of it. "I'd like to know what it was." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "I'm not sure I can—" "Mr. Petrov," I said. I placed my hands on the counter and leaned forward slightly. "I need you to understand that if a document bearing my forged signature was just notarized in this office, you are currently in possession of evidence in what will shortly become a fraud investigation. I am asking you, as a courtesy, before I involve anyone else, to tell me what you witnessed this morning." Another silence. Longer this time. He looked at his desk and then at me, and something in his expression shifted from professional caution to something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. He turned to his filing tray and removed a document. 2 pages, paper-clipped, and slid it across the counter without a word. I picked it up. My hands were steady. I read it once, and then I read it again. And the words were exactly what I had known they would be, and still somehow landed in my chest like something falling from a great height. It was a power of attorney. It authorized Eleanor Whitmore to act on my behalf in all matters relating to the property at Maple Ridge Lane, including the authority to sell, transfer, or encumber the property. At the bottom of the second page, in the signature line designated for the grantor, was my name, written in an approximation of my handwriting close enough to pass a casual examination, but not mine. Not my hand, not my pen, not my knowledge, not my consent. I stood at that counter for what felt like a very long time, looking at the signature that was supposed to be me but was not, and I thought about Vera pressing the key into my palm, about what she had said. "This is your floor." And I felt something happen in my chest that was not grief, and was not fear, and was not quite anger yet, though it would be. It was something colder and more structural, like a beam being reinforced, like the foundation of something settling. "Was this filed?" I asked. "No," Mr. Petrov said. He met my eyes. "It hasn't been submitted anywhere yet. They intended to file it with the county recorder's office this morning." He paused. I will be honest with you, Mrs. Whitmore. The signature did not look right to me. I mentioned it, and I was told you had recently injured your hand." He looked at the counter. "I should not have proceeded." "No," I agreed. "You shouldn't have." I took a photograph of both pages with my phone. I photographed the timestamp on his office clock. I photographed the entry in his appointment book that still sat open on the desk, showing the name D. Whitmore, 6 a.m. I said, "I'll need a written statement from you confirming what was signed here this morning and that the document hasn't been filed." He nodded. I think he was grateful to be asked rather than commanded. Some people cooperate better when you give them the shape of doing the right thing rather than the weight of having done the wrong one. I sat in my car in the parking lot on Alderton Street and I called my father. It was 6:43 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring because my father has never in his life slept past 5:30, which I had always considered slightly exhausting and which I was, in that moment, profoundly grateful for. "Clara?" His voice was alert immediately. "What's wrong?" "I need the name of a property attorney," I said. "A good one. Someone who handles fraud." A brief silence. "Tell me what happened." So I told him. I sat in the car with the engine off and the morning light slowly brightening around me, turning the brick of the building from gray to amber. And I told him everything. The questions about the title, the folder at the kitchen table, the phone call in the middle of the night, the car passing our street in the dark, and the document that was now photographed in my phone with a forged version of my signature on its second page. My father listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him and meant he was taking it seriously. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Go home," he said. "Don't say anything to Daniel yet. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. Then after a pause, "Are you all right?" I looked at the manila folder photograph on my phone screen. "I will be," I said. Daniel was home when I got back, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his phone, wearing the expression of a man who has returned from something he wishes he hadn't done, and is working to arrange himself back into the shape of a man who hasn't done it. He looked up when I came in, and for just a fraction of a second something moved across his face, a flicker of something between guilt and relief, as though my arriving home was simultaneously the thing he'd feared and the thing he'd wanted. "You're up early," he said. I took off my coat. I hung it on its hook. I turned around and looked at him, and I thought about how many times in the past 7 months I had let his face convince me that I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into too little, that the specific discomfort I felt every time Eleanor visited was my own uncharitable suspicion rather than accurate perception. I thought about how much easier it is to call your own instincts unreliable than to call the people you love dishonest. "I went to see Mr. Petrov," I said. The color went out of his face, not gradually, immediately, completely, as though someone had simply turned down a dial. He put down his coffee cup. He said nothing. "The power of attorney," I said. "The one with my signature on it. I've seen it, Daniel. I photographed it. Mr. Petrov is writing a statement." I sat down across from him because I wanted to be at his eye level for this. I wanted him to have to look directly at me. "I need you to tell me, and I need you to tell me right now without thinking about how it sounds. Whose idea was it?" He looked at the table for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a bird was beginning its morning. I waited with the patience of someone who no longer has anything to lose by waiting, and that patience, I could tell, frightened him more than anger would have. "It was her idea," he said finally. His voice was low. "The idea, the document, all of it. She planned it. She has this notion that the house should be in the family, that if anything ever happened between us, stop." My voice came out very quietly, but it stopped him the way a sudden silence stops a room. "Don't tell me it was only her idea, because you drove there this morning at 5:30 in the morning and sat in that office while someone forged my name. So tell me what you did, Daniel. Not what she did. What you did." He put his face in his hands. "I didn't think she was actually going to use it," he said, and even as he said it, I could see from the small, involuntary tightening of his jaw that he knew, on some level, exactly how that sounded. I thought she just wanted the security of knowing she could protect the house if what?" I said. He didn't answer that, because there was no answer to that, not one that didn't begin with, "If I chose her over you," not one that didn't contain, somewhere inside it, the acknowledgement that he had already been doing exactly that for months without calling it by its name. "How long has she been planning this?" I asked. He was quiet too long. "Daniel," I said, "how long?" "Since before the wedding," he said, very quietly, like a man dropping something he'd been carrying for a long time and was now too tired to hold. I stood up. My chair scraped back across the tile, and I stood there in my kitchen. Vera's kitchen, my kitchen, with the yellow tile that had been laid before I was born, and the window that looked out on the garden I'd planted myself. And I felt something clarify in me completely, the way water clarifies when you stop disturbing it. Since before the wedding, he had known, before we were married, that his mother had a plan for this house. He had known, and he had said nothing, and he had let me spend 4 years in the careful, affectionate delusion that Eleanor's interest in my property was merely irritating rather than instrumental. "Get out of the kitchen," I said. "I need to make a phone call." My father called back with the name of an attorney named Sandra Holt, who specialized in property fraud and who agreed to see me that afternoon. I spent the 3 hours before that appointment doing things with methodical, focused calm. I photographed every document in Daniel's study, every folder, every file, every piece of paper that had Eleanor's name on it. I found in a drawer that Daniel apparently believed I never opened a manila envelope containing 3 additional documents, a draft purchase agreement for Maple Ridge Lane with Eleanor listed as buyer at a price 40% below market value, a letter from Eleanor to Daniel dated 8 months earlier laying out, in her precise, measured handwriting, a timeline for acquiring the Maple Ridge property that accounted for my work schedule, my travel habits, and the specific windows when I was least likely to be home. The letter was 3 pages long. It referred to me throughout as the current occupant. I sat on the floor of Daniel's study and I read that letter twice, and the second time I read it, I felt something I had not expected to feel, a kind of grim, terrible admiration for the sheer scope of it. Eleanor had not done this impulsively. She had not arrived at this scheme out of spite or in a moment of anger. She had planned it the way a contractor plans a demolition, methodically, with full knowledge of the load-bearing walls, working out in advance precisely what would need to be removed and in what order. She had been doing it since before the wedding. She had been working on Daniel for years before she had ever met me. His silence, his deference, his habit of looking at the middle distance when she was in the room, these had not been the natural weaknesses of a devoted son. They had been cultivated. She had needed them. I photographed every page of the letter. I photographed the purchase agreement. I put everything back in the drawer exactly as I had found it, and I got up off the floor and went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. My eyes were dry. My hands were not shaking. I thought, Vera would have wanted to see this, not the betrayal, the steadiness, the capacity to look at something this large and this ugly and not fall down. Sandra Holt was a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses she kept taking on and off and an expression of focused, unsentimental attention that I found immediately reassuring. I laid out everything on her desk. The photographs, the timeline, the purchase agreement, Mr. Petrov's written statement, which he had emailed me before noon. And she went through it without speaking, only occasionally making a small sound that was not quite a word. When she finished, she set the reading glasses down and looked at me. "The forged power of attorney is criminal," she said. "Fraud, forgery. We're not talking about a civil matter. We're talking about something with potential criminal consequences for both your mother-in-law and, depending on what he can demonstrate about his knowledge, your husband." She picked up the letter. "This is the piece. This establishes premeditation and intent. Do you know whether any of these agreements were signed or filed anywhere?" "Mr. Petrov confirmed nothing was filed," I said. "They were going to do it this morning." "Then we're ahead of it," she said. "That matters." She leaned back slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you a direct question. What outcome do you want?" I had been thinking about this since the parking lot on Alderton Street, since my father's voice on the phone saying, "Are you all right?" Since the study floor with Eleanor's letter in my hands. I thought about Daniel's face when I'd said his mother had been planning this since before the wedding. The exhaustion in it, the particular defeat of a man who has known something terrible for so long it has become simply the terrain he lives in. I thought about whether exhaustion and cowardice and years of careful moral failure were the same thing as the deliberate, instrumental cruelty of the woman who had written that 3-page letter. I decided they were not the same thing. They were adjacent. They were related. They would have the same practical consequences for me either way, but they were not the same thing. "I want the house protected," I said, "permanently and irrevocably, in a way that cannot be approached again. I want Eleanor to face legal consequences for the forgery, and I want to do this in front of Daniel, so there is no version of this story he can tell himself afterward where he didn't see exactly what his silence made possible." Sandra Holt put her glasses back on. "I can do all of that," she said. We did it 4 days later, on a Saturday morning when Eleanor had arrived for Sunday dinner a day early. A change she had announced with breezy, last-minute cheer that I now understood to mean she wanted to observe the terrain, to check whether anything had shifted. She sat at our kitchen table in her camel coat, her perfume filling the room, her eyes moving with their habitual, proprietary attention across the surfaces of my house. Daniel stood at the counter saying almost nothing, refilling his coffee with the focused attention of a man who was trying to be invisible. Sandra Holt arrived at 11 o'clock. She was accompanied by two things: a police detective named Reyes, who worked financial crimes, and a notary from the county recorder's office who was there to document the filing of a new legal instrument, an irrevocable living trust established that morning, which placed Maple Ridge Lane in a trust structure that could not be altered, sold, transferred, or encumbered without the signature of both myself and my designated trustee, my father. Sandra placed the documents on the kitchen table in front of Eleanor with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this many times and has never found it boring. Eleanor looked at the papers. Then she looked at me. Her expression went through several phases in the space of a few seconds. Confusion, recalibration, the beginning of a social smile, and then she looked at Detective Reyes and the smile stopped. "Eleanor Whitmore," Sandra said. "Detective Reyes has a warrant related to the fraudulent power of attorney filed for notarization on the morning of November 14th at Petroff Notary Services on Alderton Street. The document bore a forged signature. We have a written statement from the notary, photographic evidence of the document and its timestamp, and a letter in your handwriting establishing premeditation." She set a copy of the letter, the 3-page letter, the one that called me the current occupant, on top of the other documents. "The county recorder has been notified. No documents relating to this property will be accepted for filing without verification protocols." Eleanor looked at the letter. She looked at it for a long time, and then she did something I had not expected. She looked at Daniel. Not with guilt, not with remorse, but with the specific fury of a general whose strategy has failed because a subordinate broke ranks. "You told her," she said. Daniel said nothing. He was looking at the floor. He had been looking at the floor for 4 days. "I found it myself," I said. Eleanor turned to look at me. "I was always going to find it. You planned everything about this very carefully except the thing that would undo it, which was that I had been kind to your driver for 2 years. James drove past my street that morning and I saw you. That's all it took." I let that sit in the room for a moment. One person being treated like a person instead of a piece of furniture, that's what you didn't account for. Eleanor stood up. She was still, even then, composed in the surface way of a person whose composure is architectural rather than felt, built from habit and long practice, not from any actual peace. She picked up her handbag. She looked at me with something that was not quite contempt and not quite respect, but lived somewhere between the two, in the territory of genuine surprise. She had not believed at any point in her planning that I was capable of what I was currently doing. I found that I did not need her to revise her estimation of me. I only needed her to leave my house. Detective Reyes asked her to sit back down. Eleanor was charged with forgery and fraud. The charges were filed 3 weeks later, and the process moved with the careful, slow momentum of legal machinery that, once started, does not stop for sentiment or family dinner arrangements. She hired a lawyer. There was a period of negotiation I was not party to and did not want to be. She did not go to prison. She was 62, had no prior record, and her lawyer argued, not entirely without basis, that the document hadn't been filed. She was given a suspended sentence, a substantial fine, and a permanent injunction prohibiting her from having any involvement with or claim upon my property. Her condo, the one Daniel paid for, became an expense. Daniel was no longer in a position to maintain, which was a consequence she had not factored into her planning. Daniel and I separated in January. It was not an explosion. There was no plate throwing, no door slamming, no operatic finale. It was something quieter and more final. The mutual acknowledgement on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen with the lights on and the dinner getting cold, that what we had built together could not hold the weight of what he had chosen not to tell me, and that I had spent long enough in a house that felt like mine only when no one else was looking. He moved into an apartment across the city. We divided what needed dividing with the help of lawyers and without cruelty, which was the last kindness I had to offer him and which I offered freely, because I understood that hating him would cost me more than he was worth the energy. James drove Daniel's things to the apartment on a Wednesday. Before he left for the last time, he came to the door and knocked, which he had never done in 4 years. I opened it, and he stood there in the afternoon light, his gray mustache slightly ruffled by the wind, his hands at his sides. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Clara," he said. "I should have—" He stopped, began again. "I should have said something sooner." "You were in a difficult position," I said, and because it was true, I didn't add anything to it. "I knew what was in the folder," he said, "that morning. I knew, and I drove anyway, and I've thought about that every day." He looked at me steadily. "When I drove past your street and I saw the light on in your kitchen, I knew you were awake. I knew you were watching." He paused. I drove a little slowly past the streetlight. I thought about that for a moment. The orange wash of the streetlight, Daniel's coat, Eleanor's silver hair, the corner of the manila folder. I thought about a man in a car, in the dark, slowing down just enough. "Thank you, James," I said, and I meant it for everything. Spring came in with the particular enthusiasm of a season that has been kept waiting too long. The garden needed work. A winter's worth of neglect. The rose bed I'd been meaning to expand for 3 years. The back porch railing that needed repainting again. I spent the first weekend of March on the porch with a brush and a can of white paint and the radio on, working in the easy rhythm of a task that has no complexity, that asks nothing of you beyond showing up and moving your arm. The neighborhood was its usual quiet self. The trees were just beginning to consider their leaves. My father came for lunch that Sunday, and we ate at the kitchen table with the yellow tile and the window looking out on the garden, and he didn't say much, but he ate 2 helpings of the soup, which was his way of saying he was satisfied. Before he left, he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the house in the particular way he had of taking things in, unhurried, appraising, with the specific attention of someone who understands what a thing costs to keep. "Your grandmother knew what she was doing," he said. "Yes," I said. "She did." After he left, I sat on the back porch with the last of the coffee and let the afternoon settle around me. The porch swing still groaned in the wind. The garden was beginning to show green at the edges of the beds. The coffee was good. Dark roast, 2 sugars, the splash of milk I'd been adding since the winter I started bringing it to a man who sat alone in the cold. I thought about kindness, how it circles back, how it keeps you company in ways you never anticipated, how the smallest and most unremarkable version of it, a thermos, a piece of foil-wrapped cake, a simple habit of treating someone like a person, can be the exact thing that saves you. Vera had left me this floor. I had kept it. I was still keeping it, and I would keep it for the rest of my life, and there was no one in the world who could take it from under me now. That was enough. That was everything.